Hello everybody and welcome back. I'm Kari and today I am doing a book review of Washington, A Life by Ron Chernow. This book has a couple of sticky notes in it that I put in so that I can do this without frantically flipping through this very large book. Overall, I really love this book. I gave it a 5 out of 5. I read it because I read Hamilton and heard that Washington, the book, was how Lin-Manuel Miranda had gotten to know Washington a little bit better for the song History Has Its Eyes on You. That said, I can totally understand how Lin-Manuel Miranda got that song from this book. It's amazing. It delves very deeply into Washington's history from the beginning of his life, basically, through the end of his life when he more or less suffocates in his bed at Mount Vernon. Anyway, moving on to the book portion of this. If you don't know anything about Washington, he's been basically deified by the American public. We have made him into this absolutely perfect pillar of American society. And don't get me wrong, he was fantastic. He kept the American Army, or militia groupings, I suppose, together during the American Revolution so that we could actually have a fighting chance at beating the British, which obviously we did. He somehow actually outlived most of his brothers and other relatives. His family had a really bad history of dying very young, and he made it to about 68 years old, which was very impressive. So, yeah, amazing guy. I really loved reading this and seeing him as a human again, because I've never seen him as a human. It's always been, he's a founding father, he's perfect, infallible, can't tell a lie, chop down a cherry tree, you know, that kind of stuff. So the first sticky note I have is just a quote that I really loved. And they're talking about Jeffersons Warning for King George III in the beginning of the book. And it says, "Kings are the servants, not the proprietors of the people. Open your breast, sire, to liberal and expanded thought. Let not the name of George III be a blot in the page of history." And that one just is rather entertaining to me because Jefferson recognizes that this is going to be important and big, but as it turns out, George III apparently wasn't intelligent enough to realize that he should try and parlay with the American populace and instead decided to fight them and then proceeded to lose. So that was entertaining to me. The second one, let's see. The second one is just sort of a curious fact. According to this book, there were about 5,000 blacks in the Continental Army at the time of the American Revolution, which apparently makes it the most integrated American force until Vietnam. I realized that with all the racism and slavery and everything that entailed up until after World War II, it makes a little bit of sense. Putting weapons in the hands of extremely disgruntled black people probably wouldn't have been the most intelligent idea, and indeed that was one of the things that Washington struggled with in allowing slaves into the military. But the fact that it was the most integrated force until 200 years later, slavery was ended in 1865, and it still took another 100 years to actually let them fight and gain any sort of recognition for it. Yeah, there's a whole rant going on inside my head. It was just a very interesting fact to me that I did not expect. I would have expected some sort of military integration before Vietnam. So then there's another curious fact. There's a lot of curious facts in this book. Oh yeah, so that famous story about the crossing of the Trenton and then defeating the Hessians on Christmas morning, that is correct. That is true. They did cross the very cold, very icy river, and Washington was on that boat with them. However, the Hessians were not drunk that morning. They were just extremely exhausted because they had been kept on high alert and Washington and his troops had been continually harassing them for a while. So when he came across the river that morning and said, "Hi guys, I'm here," they went, "Oh crap. We don't have the energy to fight you because you've been harassing us for so long." So they just gave up, basically. I I'm not sure if it's a better story with them drunk or if them basically just saying, we give up, you've been bugging us for too long. But I really liked that. Another big thing I like about this period in history, the 1700s, and really any time before about 1900, is just the education level of all these people. Washington was apparently very insecure about his lack of an education. So there are several moments in his life where he'll reference that insecurity. Another humanizing aspect of this book, which I loved. And still, he was so educated, according to at least what I think of as educated. He was very well read because he just flew through them, and knew a lot of the Roman emperors significantly more than I know. But apparently Cato, one of the well-known Romans, was the inspiration for quite a few quotes. In this, it says that he was the inspiration for Hale's "I regret that I have but one life to give for my country," before he got hanged, speech, and also for Patrick Henry's "Give me liberty or give me death" speech. Two of Cato's most famous lines, one from Nathan Hale, the other from Patrick Henry, derived from the play, and the quote is, "What pity is it that we can die but once to serve our country?" That's the Nathan Hale quote. And then the one that Patrick Henry used, or adapted, is, "It is not now a time to talk of aught, but chains or conquest, liberty or death." So we got a lot more from those Romans than I think we realize. I would also, because of this book, I really, really want to start reading and learning more about the Romans. Just because they are such a huge part of our history, and I think they're fascinating. Constantinople and how that led to the fall of the Roman Empire and all that fun stuff. But moving right along, because I don't want you, have to watch this for like 20 minutes, that would be another interesting quote that is by a British officer who is returning from his ship to retrieve some items. And he says, this is the evacuation of the British from New York afterwards, and a British officer says, "This is a strange scene indeed. Here in this city we have had an army for more than 7 years, and yet could not keep the peace of it. Now that we are gone, everything is in quietness and safety. The Americans are a curious, original people. They know how to govern themselves, but nobody else can govern them." Living now in 2017 and reading that quote strikes me as particularly, I guess, inspiring, sort of a moment of pride for my country, which I don't have very often, so that was kind of nice. But it was one of those things where you realize that spirit of the States hasn't changed in over 200 years. I think 230 at this point. So I really enjoyed the fact that they saw it then, and we haven't let go of that. We don't like other people coming in here and telling us how to govern. As I've said before, I loved reading about the different British perspectives on this, because there are quite a few British quotes in this. Obviously, that's who we were fighting. And just little observations by both the British and the founding fathers and other members of the community at the time that sort of indicate where we were going as far as now as a country. And it's very interesting to me to see how much they could predict then. So apparently Washington was also just the father of the American mule. I've got nothing more to say to that. Then poor Washington. So he put up with so much crap. He had to go through the Conway Cabal, which was basically this guy Conway raking his name through the mud, and then he had to go with, the whole, just everything that happened in Hamilton. So there's everything that, the war and all of that. And then he gets to go home to Mount Vernon for a little bit and spend time with his more or less adopted children, because he didn't have any children of his own. Washington received the call that he was probably going to be needed to be president because he was the only one who could unify the country. Chernow says, after all, the last time he had heeded his country's call in a crisis, it had embroiled him in more than 8 years of war. Which, as a quote in and of itself, is just a very nicely worded sentence, and I love Chernow's writing style. It's fantastic. But if you kind of chop the sentence up and analyze it a little bit more, you can hear almost Washington's voice just going, why can you people not figure this out on your own? He's so worn down and so tired at this point, and he doesn't want to go back in the public eye. He will, and he does, obviously, for 2 terms. Then, when Washington is president, because obviously, as I said, he accepted it for 2 terms. When he is president, he loves going to the theater, which is another thing I didn't know about Washington. We're not really taught any sort of personalizing details about presidents beyond that Lincoln enjoyed going to the theater, and surprise, he gets shot. But that is actually relevant to this because when Washington is president, Chernow says that Washington had his own private box with a soldier stationed at each stage door and 4 distributed in the gallery. And this is the best part of that quote. Washington probably enjoyed better security than did Lincoln the night of his assassination at Ford's Theater. I just chuckled at that, because with Washington going to the theater so much, I kind of had in the back of my mind, oh yeah, we had our 16th president get shot in the theater. Good thing Washington didn't get shot. And that might be why he apparently had better security. And then, okay, so I'm in law school, which you may or may not know, I can't remember if I've mentioned it before. And we have to take constitutional law. At the University of North Dakota, we have to take Con Law 1 and Con Law 2. So you go through the body of the Constitution itself, and then the second con law is the Bill of Rights. We talk about originalism as a form of interpreting the Constitution. We talk about, all those different things that I learned at high school at least. And part of my ideas is that, originalism is fine and dandy, but I never really, despite the fact that we even read the Federalist Papers, or some of them in high school, it never really clicked to me that, well, obviously they were fighting against each other. And I think maybe part of it is I knew that they had different opinions. Jefferson and Hamilton were really not liking each other. And so there were the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. And yes, they disagreed on certain elements of the Constitution. Like the Bill of Rights, that was a big thing. And they put slavery off until 1808 because they couldn't be bothered to worry about breaking up the nation that soon. Which honestly I think might have been a fair consideration. But what I didn't realize was just how vehemently they disagreed with each other. And so there's multiple pages in this, probably a solid chunk of the book if I actually counted it every time it was mentioned, where they just go at each other, basically. Specifically, Jefferson and Madison and Hamilton kind of attack each other. And it made me realize originalism is not a thing. Because if you want to go originalism, you can go Hamilton originalism, where there's federalism and the central government should be strong and should be given a lot more power, which Washington agreed with, or you can go with the Jefferson-Madison anti-federalism position, in which case it should not be given anything. The Articles of Confederation maybe just needed to be tweaked a little bit and not completely thrown out, which is what we did in the Constitutional Convention. Constitutional Convention. So, yeah, that was just an interesting side note for me personally as a law student. My favorite genre is historical fiction, right? Right. And if you didn't know that, you know it now. Anyway, one of my favorite authors, especially in high school, kind of early high school, is Anne Rinaldi. She's written so many books, and I own quite a few of them, and she wrote one on Oni or Ona Judge, who was a dower slave of Martha Washington. By dower slave, I mean that she was Martha Washington's before Martha got married, and so if any of the dower slaves ran away, George had to pay the Custis, or Martha's estate, the value of that slave. Which I also didn't realize that that's what you had to do for dower slaves. Interesting fact. So yeah, there was that, 1. And 2, a book I read by Anne Rinaldi, I don't remember the title of it right now, but I will leave it linked down below in case you want to go check it out. And it's a historical fiction, so obviously they take some liberty, but they do a pretty good job of it, or Anne Rinaldi does, of portraying Oni as this slave with a special relationship with Martha Washington, and even with George. And then she actually runs away when the Washingtons are up in Philadelphia for the last term of Washington's presidency. Oni realizes that she's not going to be free because Martha tells her, hey, I'm going to give you to his granddaughter. And Oni realizes, I don't want to do this. I want to be free. I don't know what's wrong with you people, but the color of my skin does not make me inferior, so I'm going to hightail it north. So she does. She escapes, and Washington spends an inordinate amount of time and money and actually uses his presidency to help find this woman. They do find her, but she basically refuses to go back, and Washington just gives up, essentially. So there's several pages on that whole saga in this book as well, which I enjoyed, having read a historical fiction about it, but not knowing a lot about the exact facts. There's also a book that came out recently about Washington's search for a runaway slave, or some wording like that, that I also want to read because of my interest in this from high school. And then, last sticky note is just Washington after his death. During his time in the Army and his time at the presidency, he was this sort of monolith. He was just this amazing man who was the only one who had any power whatsoever to keep this country together, especially in the early days. He almost didn't take a second term, and then did because they convinced him nobody else can do what you can do, which I think is a fair argument. I doubt anybody else could have done what he did. So, taking that, Chernow is of the opinion that when Washington dies in late 1799 or early 1800, I think it's December 1799 actually, when he dies, at any rate, the country kind of panics. Because, at least when he was alive, they had a fallback. The president who took over after Washington was John Adams. And to be perfectly honest, the Hamilton song by George III is just perfect. They're gonna eat each other alive, is what King George says in that song. And from what I've read about John Adams, I don't mean to sound disrespectful to a very dead founding father, but he was kind of an idiot. Not in the book smart way. He was incredibly intelligent, book smart. He was a lawyer, but I think he was not prepared for the administration or the unification efforts that he was going to have to put in. And so after Washington stepped down and then died fairly soon after, people just kind of went into this panic. Oh my gosh, what do we do? Especially with 1800 coming up. And the election of 1800 was a very important election for us. It showed that we could change parties without the bloodshed that we had feared. We went from the Federalists like Hamilton and Washington, who believed that a strong central government was very important, to the Anti-Federalists, Jefferson. By the way, Adams was also a Federalist. To the Anti-Federalists, Jefferson specifically, who believed that the central government, specifically the executive, should not have so much power because they feared a strong executive. Mostly because we had just come from a monarchy with a very strong executive, and that king was currently going insane as they were having the election of 1800. That was a whole mess too. But with the panic that ensued on Washington stepping down and his subsequent death, we deified him. We just couldn't not have something there. And so Chernow says that a widespread fear arose that deprived of his guiding hand, the Republic itself might founder. And then later on he says that perhaps as an antidote to such apprehension, Washington was smothered beneath national piety, and it became difficult for biographers to reclaim the complex human being. The man immediately began to merge into the myth. Chernow, in a couple sentences later, then says that Washington was basically turned into a civic deity, which is still how I think we've been taught him to this day. We see him more as this very stern sort of father figure. He's the father of our nation, but we're not taught about him trying to reclaim this one slave using presidential resources as well. We're not taught about him in the French and Indian War. Especially we're not taught about his first battle there, where he was a real idiot and lost horribly. We're not taught his views on Indians. Particularly, we're not taught that in his will he freed all of his slaves. There's a whole other bit about that, because he couldn't free the dower slaves, which were Martha's slaves, and a lot of their slaves had intermarried, and so on his death, when his slaves were freed but hers weren't, some of them stayed, and he did provide for them after his death. He provided an annuity and work for them if they wanted it, and he had them taught to read and write as well so that they could make their way. That was another big thing I loved in this book, just as in a general sense, was watching him grow from this very solidly Southern Virginia slave owner to more of an abolitionist. Not a pure abolitionist, but I liked seeing that journey and seeing that humanizing effect on him that Chernow had. I'm sorry that this is a really long book review, but I have a lot to say about this book. It's really good. So yeah, Washington A Life by Ron Chernow. Highly recommend it. Probably a great book for Christmas break when you can just curl up with a book, and at least where I live, it's nice and cold and snowy, and you can have some hot tea or coffee or whatever your beverage is and just read and learn about our founding father in a way that you would not have in high school. But that's all I got. So I will leave both links, both books down below, the one by Anne Rinaldi and the one that just came out recently. And I will also leave my Goodreads linked down below if you want to see my reviews or what I've been reading this year. Back soon with another video. Until then, bye!